Hello everyone and welcome to this Total Education lecture. We'd like to remind you that these lectures are brought to you for free, so if you'd like to help us out, give us a like down below. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the space below. And of course, don't forget to visit our website, totaleducationcentre.com.au. At the website you'll find teacher resources if you're a teacher, and of course there are student notes that go along with these lectures that will help and assist you in any examination situation. So don't forget, visit the website totaleducationcentre.com.au. Hello everyone, I'm Bruce Pattinson, and today I want to talk to you about 1984 and Metropolis and look at the two texts and some of the issues that you can compare them and look at both texts simultaneously. The first issue I'd like to start with when I talk to you today is on power. And we see the quote in the text right near the end where O'Brien says to Winston, "Power is inflicting pain and humiliation. Power is in tearing human minds to pieces and putting them together again in new shapes of your own choosing." And I think that's what 1984 is basically about. It's about the destruction of individuality. And we see that destruction of individuality clearly in Winston and clearly in Julia, but also throughout the text in many ways in the destruction of society. During his lengthy torture and interrogation, Winston has to listen to O'Brien talk about power and the definition of power. The party sees power for its own sake, basically. He says, "We are not interested in the good of others, we are interested only solely in power." It's very clear and explicit, the definition of power and how he talks about power. And if we look at that society in 1984, every aspect of society, and I'll read from the teacher notes from our unit of work here for you, every aspect of society is designed to see power from the individual, groups, and each level of society to the party. Part of this is the use of propaganda, some part surveillance and spying, while the party entwines itself in every aspect of life, even to the point of changing history. Power is the aim, and total power to the point of destroying the individual's ability to think independently. The machinery of the party is put into place under the guidance of Big Brother to eliminate all problems. And basically, that's what power is. Love has been banned because, of course, it undermines the party and it undermines the sense of power. And there's lots of things being banned, and we see children spying on their parents. We see people spying on each other. There's cameras everywhere. It's that, as we said in the context video, that Orwellian feel that everything is covered, you can't do anything. Even Winston, when he thinks he's being sneaky and writes in his diary, of course he's being seen. Nothing can beat the surveillance and nothing can beat the fear. It's an anxious society, and that's the word we sort of picked up on in our contextual talk, and you can think about that as an issue. 1984 is basically about the misuse of power. And we talk about the misuse of power in the fact that it crushes individuality and crushes freedom. And in our democratic societies, these are things that we value very highly. And I think we can compare it to Metropolis in a way that is power in Metropolis is controlled by a small elite. And I'll go on in the next phase of this lecture to talk very clearly about Metropolis and power. Power in Metropolis, as I've just said, is important in the comparative analysis, but it plays a particular role in the fabric of that society. Our first glimpse of this power is obviously through the character of John Fredison, who inspires fear amongst his staff. He rules the general population, has everything timed and managed and controlled. And we see this very clearly in the sweaty, fearful looks of the three people copying down intently every word that he says. And I think his exertion of power can be best seen, if you're looking for a technique, through the use of his hand, and he's doing what I'm doing, which is he uses his hand to guide and direct and show things. And I think that's something you could look for, and also look at the gaze that he uses and the camera angles that are up looking at him to show that significance and power. Another form of power that we see in the text is through the proletariat and that mindless power of the mob when they go on that rampage. And I think you need to look at that very carefully, because that's in complete contrast to 1984, where the proletariat doesn't have to seem any power, but I'll talk in greater detail about that later. This power is a very strong kind of power, this power from the proletariat in this film. That mob violence is destructive and inanely pointless in many ways. And I think Lang does that very well. The mob violence is very, very pointless, and that in fact it does more harm than good, and that destruction isn't the way to go. And I think the end of the film reinforces that very clearly. We also see the power of science. We see the power of science through Rotwang and his obsessive love for Fredison's dead wife Hel, and how he changes and builds the robot Maria, and she manipulates and uses her power, the power of sexuality, to do that. And we see you can make some tenuous links and work on them and make them a little bit stronger between the female robot Maria and Julia, and the sensuality and sexuality there that are both threats to the power of society. So let's just have a look at the two texts together in terms of power. Lang shows us, much like Orwell, that unfettered power, such as wielded by John Fredison and the cohort of his intelligentsia, is negative for society. And I think Orwell does that very clearly and well in 1984. We see that the party and the power of the party crushes any freedom and individuality in society, and that we need to think about how that power from the proletariat comes through in both texts. And we certainly need to think about the use of power and the manipulation of power in both texts. You can conclude in some ways, I suppose, that 1984 remains a dystopian society at the end, whereas there's more hope for the peoples of Metropolis, and this is the contrast that you might use when you discuss power in those two texts. That's just the general background of power. In the next little part of this lecture, I'm going to go through some of the other ideas and themes and talk to you about how you can use those in your essay. I'd like to continue on now talking about the role of the people and the proletariat, and I mentioned that very quickly in that last little segment on the use of power in the two texts. And I think that the people in 1984, or the proles that they're called, the impact they have is negligible. And one of the best quotes there is probably, as Orwell writes, "Or perhaps you have returned to your old idea that the proletarians or the slaves will arise and overthrow us. Put it out of your mind. They are helpless, like animals." And O'Brien says that in the text. This is very different, I think, to Metropolis, where the proletariat do have some power and certainly have that violent power. I think the concept of power for the people is redefined by Orwell. It's a much later text, and I think he sees that the established powers have certainly overtaken the role of the people in democratic societies. That's an important point that you might want to consider. In Metropolis, the role of the common people is certainly stronger. And in Metropolis, Lang said about the film, where it comes from a deep political thing, Lang said, "Metropolis, you know, was born from my first sight of the skyscrapers of New York in October 1924 while visiting New York. I thought that it was at the crossroads of multiple and confused human forces, blinded and knocking into one another in an irresistible desire for exploitation and living in perpetual anxiety." And that's that word again coming through. "I spent an entire day walking the streets. The buildings seemed to be a vertical sail, scintillating in very light, a luxurious backdrop suspended in the dark sky to dazzle, distract and hypnotise. At night the city did not simply give the impression of living, it lived as illusions live. I knew I should make a film of all these impressions." So he gets his general idea from a giant city, and that's what you see in the film. But as we said, he sees the proletariat very differently to Orwell. He sees their actions, the violence of their actions, as counterproductive and dangerous. And it comes through in that film that unthinking rebellion leads to near deaths of the children, for example, and it's shown as not a positive thing. The workers in Metropolis are probably distinguished only by the conformity that they share. They have names and numbers and are portrayed mostly as a mass, sharing movement, clothing and habits. The scene where they're fed into the machine is particularly useful to talk about in this. Lang, I think, seems to be sympathetic about the working class, but doesn't like the blind, dangerous power that they could wield. And I think that's probably where you're going to make that comparison. But I think if you go back and look at the anxiety again, you see that draw the proletariat together. Another idea that you might want to look at in here that links very clearly to the proletariat is the sense of free will and individuality. And I think both texts are very strong on the fact that they take away the free will and individuality of those. As it says in O'Brien says to Winston, "You are the last man, you are the guardian of the human spirit." And of course he then goes on to break Winston. And I think free will and individuality in the text are taken away, but I think both composers of those texts value free will and individuality. And if you look, I think, although we don't particularly like Winston as a character necessarily, we do admire the sense of free will that he has and his obligation to try and remain an individual. In Metropolis, free will and individuality are important also, and indeed key elements to the effective society. Maria, for example, is a free will and a free spirit and a good leader. Frida, the same. And Frida is the one that binds together, and his individual actions and individual courage are the thing, along with Maria, that changes the outcome of that film to make it have hope. So I think if you look very closely, and you can obviously go into more detail on that, I'm just touching on it at the moment, but that sense of free will and individuality is extremely important in both texts, and I think both composers value that very much. And so when you do your comparative study, you probably need to look at all those issues and a few more. They're just starters for you. Make some judgments about which one does it. What do they say about individuality? What do they say about power? What do they say about all the issues that I've talked about? Find your examples, back it up. Orwell perhaps crushes individuality, Lang doesn't. Frida breaks away, for example, from those constraints. There's far more individuality in Metropolis than 1984. There's far more sense of hope through all those ideas. However, you need to make up your own mind. You need to look at all the examples and work it. They're just a few ideas to get you started. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. Look out for our next one. Don't forget, if it was helpful, give us a like, ask any questions, or leave some comments. Thanks for your time.